This lesson will cover Chapter 12 on Congress. We'll be looking at the Senate and the House of Representatives and congressional behaviors. First, let's cover some basics. In Congress, there are two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. There are far more representatives in the House. 435 members represent a number of districts in each of the states, based on population. These members are elected every 2 years. They're closest to the people, and so their terms are much shorter. There are 100 senators, 2 for each state. If you're familiar with the first unit, you know that Congress was a compromise to appease both large states and small states. Large states on the basis of population, and small states with equal representation in the Senate. Where all members of the House of Representatives are up for re-election every 2 years, senators serve 6 years, which means only 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years. It's also important to note that senators from the same state will not be elected in the same cycle. You'll probably notice that that doesn't coincide with what we saw in Georgia during the 2020 election, where there was a runoff in 2 senatorial seats. That is because one of those senators that was running was actually appointed, not elected, because the senator had retired, so that was an exception. The incumbency effect is something we see strongly represented within Congress, and we can see it in both chambers. It's the most important factor in determining success in a congressional campaign. Just to be clear, an incumbent is an individual who already has the status of holding that office position. So they're running for re-election. The reason they have the upper hand is because they've got that stronger name recognition. Folks that represent their constituency already know them, are familiar with them, and are more inclined to vote for them when they recognize their name on a ballot. Much of the reason they're better known is because they've got easier access to media coverage. They've probably been featured on television. You see them frequently in ads. You may also see them speaking to news correspondents. So, of course, it makes sense that you'd be more familiar with them. Also, redistricting. That is a more political way in which they have the upper hand. So when district lines are drawn, and since they're drawn every 10 years, whichever political party happens to be in power is going to have a disproportionate amount of power and say in what political party has the advantage. And of course, typically the office holders already reflect that political party. We can also look to franking, which is the privilege of sending mail for free by members of Congress. So imagine the many people you're trying to contact and send information to. That is something that an incumbent certainly has an advantage over the opposition to. And then the last one is campaign contributions. So especially when we're looking at established special interest groups and the PACs that they have attached to them, where they've been able to raise amounts of money, you might find that they're typically going to donate to whichever candidate is going to be more than likely to be elected. And so to ensure that they are given attention and the policies they care about are given attention, they're going to be more inclined to donate to those individuals. Reapportionment and redistricting are 2 very important concepts you should be familiar with. First, we'll look at reapportionment, and that's the reallocation of seats in the House based on changes in a state's population since the last census. The census is conducted every 10 years. That's why it's so important, and there's a lot of pressure for citizens of a state to respond to that census because that can determine how many representatives the state gets. If the population in a state increases, that could mean more representatives. If it decreases, it could mean that they lose representatives. And then when we look at redistricting, that's the redrawing of congressional district boundaries within a state. As mentioned before, every 10 years, these boundaries can be redrawn, and whatever political party is in power is going to have a stronger say in how those lines are drawn up. Redistricting can often lead to a strategy known as gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is the practice of drawing legislative district boundaries to benefit an incumbent political party. Most forms of gerrymandering might be considered legal, but it is considered unconstitutional when it eliminates the minority party's influence statewide. We have seen increased partisanship in Congress. Many would argue that technology plays a part, as congressional seats can be arranged to ensure a safe seat for a political party more efficiently now. We notice that safe seat representatives act in a partisan manner without the fear of losing their positions, and Republican members in the House have become increasingly more conservative, while Democrats have moved to a more liberal or progressive direction. Gerrymandering can lead to majority-minority districts. This is where a legislative district is composed of a majority of a given minority community. What this means is that that minority may not make up the majority of the representation within a state, but they can be consolidated into a district to be able to have a disproportionate amount of say in how an election might be determined in that district. One goal perhaps may be to make it likely that a member of the minority will be elected to Congress. For the most part, majority-minority districts are legal, but there are some exceptions. We saw an exception to this in the landmark Supreme Court case, Shaw versus Reno. In this case, the court ruled that redistricting based on race has to be held to a standard of strict scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. The court in this case held that although North Carolina's reapportionment plan was racially neutral, the resulting district shape was bizarre enough to suggest it constituted an effort to separate voters into different districts based solely on race. The powers of Congress can be found in the Constitution. And when we talk about enumerated powers, we're talking about powers that are specifically listed in the Constitution as belonging to Congress or the legislative branch. Take a look at the powers listed to the right. Congress has the power to pass legislation. They make policies. Congress has the power to declare war. Major misconception that the president does. No, Congress declares war. The Senate has the power to ratify treaties signed by the president. Senate must give its consent to the president's appointment of federal judges, ambassadors, and the heads of executive departments. Congress may impeach the president and remove them from office, and Congress may establish the number of Supreme Court justices and regulate the court's jurisdiction. Now, although these powers are, to a large extent, explicitly stated in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that Congress's power is limited to just those. The Necessary and Proper Clause allows Congress to legislate in matters not described in the enumerated powers. So some examples, which were mentioned before, include reforming healthcare and immigration. Now, in addition to the Constitution, there might be some informal powers that are derived from Supreme Court decisions, the media, and the people. So the Supreme Court upholds constitutionality of law. The media sways public opinion, which again, when you talk about the constituents of these representatives being able to elect them and re-elect them, it's no surprise that they feel very constrained and to a large extent under the constraint of the constituents, their views, and their public opinion. The people are the key source of congressional power through civic participation. Now, this becomes really complicated when we look at the contrast between the people and political parties. There can tend to be a lot of overlap. And in addition to that, we can see where individual politicians or members of Congress may feel a sense of loyalty to their political party and may want to vote along party lines when maybe perhaps their constituency may be more diverse, maybe more moderate, and perhaps may also be in conflict with what their public opinion is in contrast to that of the political party that they feel a responsibility to be loyal to. But oftentimes we also see that constituencies align with those political parties. So that's where it can get complicated. Ultimately, the main purpose of Congress is making laws, right? What else do we call that? Policy making. So nothing really matters unless it impacts or influences policy. And again, as was mentioned before, a legislator may be pressured to vote for a policy that clashes with constituents' views. So what if their constituents have an opinion that is different from the way that their political party is requiring them to vote? This is where we can revisit representation models. Let's go ahead and recap what the difference is between a trustee model and a delegate model or instructed delegate model. So a trustee model is where a member of the House or Senate follows their conscience when deciding issue positions. So a legislator may act in opposition to the clear wishes of their constituents. Again, maybe they believe that their constituents are uninformed. Maybe they don't fully understand how a policy might directly affect them, and they may feel that they are better suited to make decisions that are in the best interest of their constituents. In contrast, the instructed delegate model is where legislators vote in keeping with constituents' views. So maybe on moral grounds, they don't necessarily agree with how they may be voting, but they vote because that is how the constituents in their district would want them to vote. And because they feel constrained by the people or that they are serving the people, they believe that that's how they should vote. Now, again, it's super important to know that members of Congress don't run exclusively on one of these models. Sometimes it just depends on the issue at hand. And sometimes a member of Congress may use these models as a way to explain their position or stance on a particular policy. Even when that may contradict an explanation they give for voting a different way on a completely different policy. It also is really easy for members of Congress to separate themselves from what might be argued to be the correct or righteous thing to do by saying that it is, in fact, the way that their constituents would have wanted them to vote. So, two other concepts related to Congress: pork barrel legislation and earmarks. So when we look at pork barrel legislation, we're talking about the appropriations of funds specifically. And this appropriation or appropriations of funds happen to be for special projects. Those projects are often located in their congressional districts. So when they go back and they ask for voters to vote retrospectively, they can say, hey, look at all the money that I brought to this district. Look at all the jobs that were created because of this. Look at how beneficial this was. And so they can use that to their advantage. Transportation bills specifically are commonly used to create pork barrel projects. Looking at earmarks, that's a designation within a spending bill that provides for a specific expenditure. So when we look at provisions that are written into bills, they may allocate funds in a way that might be seen as a roundabout way or kind of a loophole to having to go through the formal expenditure process. And to a large extent, Republicans eliminated this in 2013, but we have seen it increase largely since then. Another common thing for legislators to do is to write riders or to place riders into a bill. And so what a rider is something that really doesn't seem to have much to do with the bill at hand, but because the bill has a title that appears bipartisan, that on the surface, if constituents knew very little about that bill, would see it as a no-brainer as to how members of Congress ought to vote. So let's just assume that this bill is called a Jobs for Veterans Act. But let's say that there is a rider that is built into that bill that tries to create tax incentives for oil companies that hire veterans, right? People may be very opposed to that because it increases the maybe the power of these oil companies to some extent, or cuts them some tax breaks. But in turn, people would support it because it supports veterans.